so much. So, in 1995, at the Beijing Women's Conference, a very famous woman said a famous quote that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. It was it was an absolutely groundbreaking statement to have made at the time. And yet, 15 years prior to that, in Eritrea, that was already understood. And for the 40 years, of the National Eritrean Union for Women, that has been the ruling understanding. You know, we've heard a lot of speeches, wonderful speeches about the history of the union and of women in Eritrea. And you all know far better than I do about the history of this important organization. What I thought I would give you here today is kind of an outsider's view of how I saw the organization, how it's different or similar to others around the world, and why, as an outsider, it matters to me. This past week, I was in Johannesburg at the African Investment Forum, and I moderated an event that was to create women investment champions. And there were some seriously high-powered women in the room. The former head of the African Union, former heads of companies, the CEO of a major mining company. These are people you'd want to go and network with at an investment conference. There were about 150 women. There were 2 men. Look around the room today. I think it's an interesting difference. You know, as many of you know, I lived and worked and reported in Eritrea during the most recent war. Before that, I lived in Paris for many years. And as an American, of course, we think that everything we do is bigger and better than everyone else, and I thought I knew all about the women's movement around the world. And so when I moved to France, I thought, those women are really backwards. They don't understand women's liberation at all. Of course, we invented it, right? And, you know, I saw the French women, and they sort of reveled in their femininity and in, you know, the way they dressed and their customs, and yet there were very few women who were in leadership positions. There were jobs that women couldn't do, things like that. And a French friend of mine explained it to me. And she said, you know, in the US, the women's movement started from the standpoint that men and women are equal. And so they need to have the same things. And so you have women in leadership in America, not as many CEOs as we'd like, but some. And we have, you know, we want to have women in the army, and we have things like women truck drivers and things that are traditional male positions. In France, the movement started from the standpoint that men and women were different, and they had different needs. And so the French have things like childcare, maternity leave, time to go and take care of elderly parents, things we don't have in the US. So in Eritrea, like all things Eritrea, the Eritrean women's movement set its own course. And it combined things to where men and women are different and have different needs, and yet there is no social justice without equality. And so you have things like maternity leave guaranteed, but you also have women in the army. You know, I'm a Western journalist specializing in Africa, and almost by definition, that means that I am supposed to be doing, very excited to be reporting on women's issues in Africa. What would Africans do without Americans coming in and saving them, of course. So, before I moved to Eritrea, I certainly did my fair share of women's stories. I did stories on girls not going to school and on forced marriages and violence against women. And, of course, on Western organizations who came to take care of those girls because, of course, Africans couldn't. When I got to Eritrea, I realized I didn't really do stories on these things. I remember one time doing a story on the National Eritrean Union of Women, and I interviewed Lord Gabriel, who was the president at the time. But I really didn't do many. And when somebody asked me to come and talk today, I started thinking, why didn't I do more? I mean, this is one of the most important organizations in Eritrea. So why didn't I do more on the union and on women's rights? Well, first of all, I was there in 1998 to 2000, so I was a little bit busy at the border. But other than that, I think it's because in Eritrea, human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. And so, you know, these things were just part of the fabric of society. They were part of what everybody was looking at. You know, fighting these issues were not just part of the struggle, and you know, they were very much a part of it. They were integrated into the struggle, into post-independent Eritrea. And the union was not a separate organization held sort of outside from the mainstream. It was very much a part of the fabric of Eritrean society. I never saw in Eritrea things like marches of women protesting the patriarchy, or radicalized women decrying the faults of their oppressors. Instead, what I saw were dedicated men and women working together to create a just society, lifting everybody up, men and women together. And that's what I think is really different. It's remarkable that the National Eritrean Union of Women, from its inception, was not a radicalized group pitting men against women. It was not women as victims who had to overthrow the patriarchy. It was a joint struggle. And the goals of the 30-Year War, of course, you know, we've heard people talk about how this was to gain liberation, but also to transform the society and to create a fair and just society, the social justice that is so much a part of Eritrea. But at the core of this was a recognition that all of us are human, and that men and women all need a fair and just society. It's not just women against men, but a combination of women and men. And that both were part of an oppressive system under Ethiopian domination, and together they fought to transform the country and to free the country. You know, this isn't just during the struggle that they fought this. This past summer, I took a group of students, Karen over here was with me and my daughter next to her, from George Mason University, a study abroad program. And among the things that we did, we went to see Mendefata Hospital to see the National Fistula Center, which is an amazing thing that Eritrea has done. So fistula is one of the most difficult afflictions that women face, and it's really caused mostly by poverty and very much by inequality. Eritrea, 7 years ago, they did their first fistula operation, and they have had unbelievable results. You know, it's gone from a few hundred women a year to now just 6 when we were there in July. And this comes about because it was a comprehensive program. You know, this is a program where they did education on how to avoid this and how to give birth in ways where you would not end up with fistula. They're doing things like building dorms next to clinics so that women, as they're in their last month of pregnancy, can come and stay there and then be ready to go to a hospital when they're giving birth. They increased the medical professionals who are there for helping women to go through birth, and they sent their best surgeon to be trained in corrective surgery. It can take 2 years and multiple operations to cure a woman of fistula. In Eritrea, the cost to a woman for a couple of years and several operations, the cost to her for having this, 0. There is no charge at all. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And during those 2 years, the women have access to classes in literacy. They take classes in various kinds of economic empowerment so that when they leave, they have a skill that they can then use to earn money afterwards. This was very typical of Eritrean development: self-reliant, social justice, and a holistic approach. So how did this happen? It happened because of a total commitment of government and the people, of men and women, and everyone working together to make it happen. You know, I look at the modern American women's movement. This was started by Betty Friedan, many of you know, and the original movement was to free both men and women from the social norms. But unfortunately, that quickly changed to a very adversarial relationship. And today in the US, feminism is often seen very negatively, both by men and women. Feminazi has become the term for women who demand too much. But I wonder sometimes when I see Eritrea, what if we had done things the way that Eritrea did, and that it wasn't adversarial? Would we today in the States still have to fight so hard to have women's health care included in our insurance? Would we have had a woman president by now? Would there have even been a need for a Me Too movement? To me, there was great wisdom in the way that the National Eritrean Union for Women was set up, and the numbers really prove it. You know, when you look at the under-5 mortality rate, it's drastically down since independence, and in fact, the rate for girls is actually better than the rate for boys. The literacy rates, over 90%. In adult literacy, women are a bit higher illiteracy rates than men, but in under 15, no difference at all. That's pretty remarkable. We've heard about FGM. It used to be 95%. Imagine that, 95% of women. And now, first of all, I have actually read statistics, you mentioned 10%. I have read statistics that it was 50%. But very interesting, there was an article by some researchers at Harvard, and they had gone village to village and found that the girls, when they looked at under 15 of what is happening now, that it's at 7%, which I think is just unbelievable. I think of 95% down to 7%. That's a total transformation of society. This is what happens when men and women fight side by side for a fair and just society. You know, these numbers are from UNESCO and other world organizations, but there are other numbers that they don't capture. And one might even question whether they don't capture them because those numbers wouldn't do so well for the West. In Eritrea, when I lived there, I could walk down the street at 2 o'clock in the morning and no one would bother me. As an American, as an American, I would never do that. I never saw it when I lived here as an American. I never saw that as an issue. I mean, that's just normal. As a woman, I am to be careful. I am to be vigilant. I am, always to assume that somebody could at any time hurt me. And so I had to take care of myself. It was my issue, and I had to take care of myself to not put myself in that position. And there are some neighborhoods where if you're walking down the street, well, as they say, you're just asking for it. So it's on the woman to have kept herself safe, not on society. There was an American professor who did a thing in a classroom. He said, everyone go to the right of the classroom if you have ever not done something because you feared for your safety. Go to the left if you've never had that happen. Very quickly, all the women were on one side, all the men were on the other side. This is the norm in other societies, really all over the world. As a journalist, I often interview men. You get used to laughing off all these inappropriate questions. You go to bars and restaurants, and not just in the US, but throughout the world. We all know what we see there. We see men being quite inappropriate, and women having to sort of politely fend it off, right? I came to realize something in Eritrea, that as a woman, I too had the right to walk down the street without fear. That it is a human right to live freely, to move freely, to be free from fear of harm, to be free from harassment. Throughout my time in Eritrea, I never once had a man treat me inappropriately. I never saw men sitting around shouting catcalls at women passing by. At the recent festival, I told a story about a man who came up to me when I was still living at the Sunshine Hotel. And he said, I've seen you around here. Would you like to come over to my mother's for lunch? And I laughed and I thought, wow, this is the only country in the world where a stranger would come up and invite me to lunch, and that I would even consider going to his house for lunch. I was reporting at the time on the biggest war in the world, but in my daily life, I didn't feel fear at all, and I think that's really remarkable. I could say that what I saw in Eritrea is an outlier, that it's so wonderful and it's so different and so great, and it is. But that's not really what we should say. Eritrea is what we should expect wherever we are. This should be the norm, what happens in Eritrea. What I saw and felt in Eritrea, I believe that comes from a women's union that was part and parcel of the entire society. And it comes from a women's movement that was a shared goal between men and women. And that to me is the legacy of 40 years of the National Eritrean Union of Women. Thank you so much.